So let's talk about Nigeria. Um, the nation of Nigeria has an area we call the Niger Delta, which is a delta of the Niger River. And this delta is really not very far above sea level, as can be seen here by Google Earth data. We find that within 3 meters of sea level, we see areas very deep into Nigeria that are not very far. When you go to 4, 8, and 10 meters, you begin to realize that Nigeria is very close to sea level. We have the added challenge of the Niger Delta being an area that is actually subsiding from oil drilling, natural gas, and very possibly because of the water flow. So getting into the water flow into the Niger Delta, we find that the Niger River that always flowed into the Niger Delta since quite a long time ago now has, from the 1960s, a dam in the river, holding back much of the water for irrigation and removing much of the water from the river. Now, how wide a river becomes when it's created is controlled by how much water there is. And if there's a lot of water, you have a wide running river. And if there's very little water, you generally end up with narrower rivers. And as we look at the Niger Delta, we see that there are many different sizes of waterways based on how stable the shores were and how much water had taken that path. Now, as the amount of water goes up, the river will get wider. So when people look at the Niger Delta, they go, well, all the rivers look like they're much wider than they should be. And the reason for that is that in the past, prior to the dam going in, a lot more water flowed. And so now what we have is wide, shallow rivers, not optimal by nature because an unnatural thing has happened, whereas the amount of water flowing through them has been reduced. That's a little bit rare in nature, although it could happen, but in this case it's induced by a dam. So when the water flows over a wider river, it flows slower. When it flows slower, it loses more of its solids, its carried silt, and the river silts up and becomes shallow. And when all your rivers have become shallow because not enough water to transport material to keep the riverbed deep and the river capacity for water high, you create a situation where any added water that appears causes flooding. Because the river itself is shallow, its banks are weak, and you get very broad flooding outside of the banks of the river. The banks no longer control it, and that's the situation that we have throughout the Niger Delta. So when we ask how do you fix this problem or what would you do about it, well, there's a couple issues. One is, since there is almost no elevation rise, very little elevation rise, you'll notice that the elevation deep in here is still less than 10 meters above sea level. Everything that's blue is 10 meters above sea level or less. Um, Meanwhile, as you can see, we are in fact many miles inland, far away from the coastline. So there's very little drop in the water. So that means that there's really no opportunity along here to place a dam and make, and there's no way along here to place a dam and make the and make storage area for the water, so that in case of a flood you could store a bunch of it behind some cofferdam or something. And so we have to come up with a different solution to solve the problem of flooding. We also have a couple other issues. One, of course, is there's a huge number of channels running all over Nigeria. And while they're very silted over and not always navigable, if these many, many channels could be made navigable, this could become one of the most interesting places in the world to go boating. And if these channels could be made able to support narrow boats, then thousands of narrow boats could provide some wonderful tourism, allowing people to get very close to nature without destroying nature, because you're in a narrow boat on a channel, and things like elevated camera, high-resolution cameras, and of course drones on your narrow boat could help you explore and experience the wildlife in an extremely unintrusive way and generate hundreds of millions of dollars in tourists. We're talking about 100,000 narrow boats, each maybe hosting 4 tourists each at a time at $175 a night, something like that. So then you say, well, okay, there's hundreds of millions of dollars, but what would it take to get us there? What would you have to do? Well, what you'd have to do is what you have to do anyways. All of these water channels have to be opened up so that they can transport water. They must be dredged. They must be deep enough for a decent water flow. Otherwise, we're never going to stop the flooding that goes on upstream. The second thing is that as the land subsides and the sea level rises, all of this area in blue will begin experiencing saltwater encroachment, meaning that you'll have entire cities where they can no longer drink the water from the ground. They'll have to truck it or bring it long distances, or just abandon the residential areas. And some of these, like Port Harcourt and stuff, can be quite large cities left without the fresh water that they need. By putting weirs in these riverways, causing a higher elevation of water to be backed up behind them most of the years, you increase the hydraulic pressure of the retained fresh water and can, to some extent, hold saltwater encroachment at bay. And this is important because the saltwater encroachment will cause the trees and the foliage to die out, and then the banks of the river no longer have roots to hold them together. You say, well, salt water you could put in mangroves. Well, that transition process, if it happens naturally, is a long-term transition process with a lot of very dead, muddy erosion happening in the meanwhile, and probably no successful transition, even though maybe we could go in it with mechanical intervention, plant mangroves when the water switches from fresh to brackish to seawater. But some of that, most of that, can be prevented by simply a system of weirs and locks. They also make the ability to maintain the navigability of the channels much easier because the weirs will hold a certain amount of water level back, and it makes for a very quaint and enjoyable, leisurely travel on the river systems, and could help us support as many as 10,000 more narrow boats or residential tourism facilities. When we say narrow boats, we're talking about boats with very nice hotel room style suites in them, living areas, and nature observatory systems. And so the the tourism market possibility is one way that you would pay for the weirs, pay for the work on the channel system, and create income and a good financial base for the people of the region that doesn't involve mowing down all of the rainforest to create it. So there may be other ways to deal with this problem, but it's not going to go away, and we are going to have to deal with it. So please provide your comments and feedback. I apologize for making a boring video. I'm not very good at this. And let me know what you think.